Greetings and welcome to episode 17 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation, 10 to 15 minutes at a time. And just to recall a little bit where we've been starting in Genesis 1 in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, and God's original intent in creating the heavens and the earth and the man and woman and humanity and the mother of all living, Adam, and Eve. God's intent was to build a relationship with them that was real and personal. People wanted more. The problem, the grumpiness, the dissatisfaction in the garden always caused them to want more, causes us to want more. In Genesis 1 through 11, remember that's what we call the prehistory. Genesis 12, God called Abraham. God decided that I want to be a little bit more specific in the way in which I'm drawing humanity to myself. So about 2000 BC is when the story of Abraham begins. And the story of Jacob that we're going to be talking about today, Jacob's name was then, toward the end of his life, after he wrestled with God, changed to Israel, and he became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. We'll be covering that in the next couple of episodes. In Genesis 12, God gave the blessing to Abraham that he would be great and all of his descendants would be great. Finally, Abraham and Sarah had a son, Isaac. As we saw in the last episode, Abraham called Isaac to go up and Abraham to go up and sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, of course, that was saved, although Abraham didn't know it at the time. Isaac grew, and in time Isaac married Rebekah. Rebekah was Isaac's wife, and in time they had twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau was the first one that was born. Esau would be traditionally the one to whom the blessing would be given from the father to the son to Esau's generation and offspring, except that the blessing was stolen by Jacob. Remember when Rebekah gave birth, she gave birth first to Isaac and then to Jacob. The funny thing is about that, Jacob, the second of the twins, came out gripping Esau's heel, if you can imagine that. Now, Esau, firstborn, was described as a hairy baby. The Bible says that Esau came out all red, and his body was a hairy mantle. So he was a furry little guy. That's why they called him Esau, which means hairy or furry or Sasquatch baby. He was a little guy, very important. Now that becomes more important later in the story about Esau being a hairy little hairball, because he was the one to whom the inheritance of the family should be going, but it didn't go that way. As they grew, Esau became a skilled hunter outside with his dad, a man's man. Jacob stayed at home with his mom and cleaned and cooked and did dishes and learned how to run the Kirby vacuum cleaner. Esau was a man's man. He enjoyed being outdoor. He loved to hunt. He was covered from his head to his toes with hair. Jacob, on the other hand, was smooth-skinned. He was an errand boy for his mom. He did stuff around the house. Different boys, different interests, and different temperaments. Jacob was, as we'll see, a schemer. One day, Esau came home from his hunting expedition, and he was tired and he was hungry. Jacob was cooking a pot of stew. Esau wanted some, but Jacob just didn't give him a bowl of stew. He was a schemer. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a bowl of stew for the family birthright inheritance. And Esau said, okay, whatever. He was just hungry. He just wanted to have a bowl of porridge. So the Bible says that Esau despised his inheritance and gave the family blessing orally to Jacob for a bowl of soup. Many years later, When Father Isaac was feeling old and sick and blind, he started to prepare to bless the family Sasquatch, little, who had grown now, furry Esau. And Mother Rebecca heard about the conversation with Esau, preparing himself to pass the blessing on to Esau. Rebecca did not want Esau, her firstborn, to get the blessing because her favorite child was Jacob. And so Rebecca prepared a deception on her own. She instructed Jacob, her favorite son, to kill some goats, strip them of their fur, and prepare a tasty meal for his dad. Rebecca stitched the furs of the goats to cover Jacob's body. That's how furry Esau was. And a blind Isaac could be fooled by his fair-skinned son Jacob wearing goat fur. And so blind Isaac felt the arm of Mama's boy Jacob. He smelled him. He said, "Man, you smell like a goat. You smell like you've been out in a barn." And so Isaac blessed Jacob and passed the blessing of the family inheritance, on to Jacob instead of Esau. And when Esau came back into the tent to prepare a meal for his blind father, and he realized that he had been tricked out of his inheritance, he was livid. He was furious. So Isaac, the dad, realized that he'd been fooled, and all of a sudden that added fuel to the fire and the anger that was already there in this dysfunctional family system. And this is what the Bible says. From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing, and Esau began to scheme about killing his brother. I mean, this is sibling rivalry stuff at its worst. So Jacob goes on a run from his brother and his family. And in Genesis 28, Jacob is alone. He's on a 500-mile trip, walking through the dangerous desert to stay with his uncle Laban. We'll be hearing about him in the next episode or two. Laban, where he was hoping he could find a wife and settle down and get away from all of the dysfunction and the deceit of his past. And, you know, with all he'd done, that's pretty understandable, because it would be really nice if life were easy, but it's not. Sometimes it may feel like it would be nice to do what Jacob did and just run away and leave it all behind. Broken relationships, run away. Failure, run away. Painful loss, run away. Bad choices, run away. Guilt and regret, run away. It sometimes may feel like the best thing to do is just distance ourselves from our stuff and just run away. And that's what Jacob did. Now we find him in Genesis 28, 7 and 8, on his journey alone. He's lying there alone, lying on the ground, his head on a rock, alone, and asleep. Asleep. Up until this point, his life had been full of struggle and conflict, and now that struggle reaches its full fruition. It's a low point in Jacob's life. The mess of his life had just piled up around him, and here he was, miles away from home, physically and materially and spiritually alone, and out there in the desert, sleeping with his head on a rock. All he had was a shirt on his back, and he was distant from God and without hope. And he was in a very bad place. And as he slept, he had a dream of a ladder with the angels, with the angels going up and down a ladder. And in his dream, he saw the Lord standing beside him and telling him the blessing of the promise that God had originally given to Abraham that went to Isaac, his father. And now the blessing was passed on to Jacob, even after he stole the blessing from his hairy brother Esau, the Sasquatch baby, the firstborn son. Here's what God said to Jacob when he stood behind him. God said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which I will give to you and your offspring your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread to the west and to the east and north and to the south, and all families of the earth will be blessed in your offspring. God says to Jacob, whose name would become Israel and have 12 sons. God says to Jacob, know that I am with you, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Okay? Wow. Alone out there in the desert. And it's interesting. One of the Bible themes is that God often makes himself known in transforming ways in the solitary times. Like in the wilderness where Moses experienced God in the burning bush, or in a dark place like a dark temple on a night when God woke Samuel from his sleep, or in a stable in a little village called Bethlehem, or in the middle of a storm on a Sea of Galilee with the disciples, or sleeping in the middle of nowhere like Jacob with your head on a rock. It's interesting how sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of physically nowhere, material, spiritually, when we feel most alone and deserted. That's sometimes where God shows up. That's the tension that Jacob experienced in the midst of this utter desolation, where he's just kind of covered in all of the mess that he's made of his life. It's then in the deep darkness of night that God showed up in Jacob's dream. And when he awoke, Jacob said that he realized that this was a sacred place. He says, surely God is in this place. I didn't know it. God is in this place, and I didn't know it. Now, remember the story that we may have learned when we were kids? We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder, soldiers of the Lord. Every rung goes higher, higher. We are climbing. The interesting thing about Jacob's ladder is that that's not correct. Jacob doesn't climb the ladder. The ladder is for God and the angels to come up and down. God stood next to Jacob and says, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to promise that you will have an inheritance beyond your wildest dreams. I'm going to be with you. That's the message that will run through much of the Old Testament, way into the New. I am with you. Jesus said, go make disciples, and I am with you to the close of the age. God says, I'm not going to leave you or forsake you in Isaiah. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Cast your cares on him. No power in the sky above or the earth below, nothing in all of creation, Paul says in Romans 8, will be able to separate you from God's love. And that's what Jacob discovered in this seemingly God-forsaken, middle and nowhere place. Jacob awoke and said, surely God's in this place, and I didn't know it. Then he says, how awesome is this place? Those two sentences, I think, are so important. When we're in the midst of a mess, we can look around and think, God is in this place, and I didn't recognize it. How awesome is this place? Repeat that with me. Surely God is in this place, and I didn't know it. How awesome is this place? That's what Jacob realized. The Lord is in this place. I didn't even know it. In the midst of his dark dreams, God was in this place. He didn't know it. And then he said, how awesome is this place? How awesome is this place? Think about that as you wake in the morning and say it's going to be a great day. When you go to bed at night and think, here's some things for which I am grateful. Maybe tonight, remember that God is in your place. Even though you might know it, God is in your place. How awesome is that? No matter what situation you're in, God is in this place, and I didn't know it, so how awesome is this place? I look forward to being with you for the next episode, and until then, make it a great day. Bye-bye.